Hi, my name is Casper Jefferson, and this is a small video I made of me constructing a miniature bust using Sculpey, or Super Sculpey that is. Please don't take this video or anything I might say during the video as any kind of authority, as I've only been making these models for 3 to 4 days at this point, so I'm in no way experienced with this medium, but do enjoy the video for what it is. If I keep doing this, I might continue and make a better video once I know more about the process and have more experience. I used Super Sculpey for this model. I have previously tried using regular Sculpey, and I found that I was spending more time battling with the actual material than with the design of my model. Then I read some articles online about professionals using Super Sculpey, and several of them are mentioning that was really the material to use, and it was completely different from regular Sculpey. So I picked up a couple of packages and tried experimenting with it, and for me it really works. It just naturally does what I want it to do, and so it allows me to focus completely on the model. And unlike regular clay, there's no cracking and no little piece of debris collecting when you're pushing things around. So I find this to be a really pleasant material to work with. As you can see from this video, I've created a small tinfoil base structure that I built my model around. And the reason for this is two different things. First, it provides a more rigid center for my sculpture. If you're doing something larger than these mini busts, you probably want to use something that's even more rigid than just tinfoil, simply to keep larger soft parts in pure clay from falling over when you're working with them, and also to give you something that you kind of push against when you're working the clay, so you're not just pushing the clay out the other side. And the second reason is when you're baking this, you need to bake it based on the thickness of the clay. So the thicker the clay, the longer you have to bake it. And if you bake something for a really long time, like if you have really thick areas, then the really thin details will get overbaked and they'll end up getting completely scorched in the oven. So by using the tinfoil in the center, I ensure that the whole figure has a relatively thin thickness everywhere, which means that the maximum baking time will be low enough that even the small details will survive nicely. I haven't tried this myself, but I've seen other people working with bigger sculptures with more varying thickness around the sculpture, and they did the baking in steps where they first baked what the small pieces needed and then wrapped those in tinfoil and then continued baking, so they were sort of protecting those areas from getting too much heat, and that would probably work, but this is a convenient way to ensure that these small models don't get overbaked. Now, before I start the actual modeling, as you could probably see in the beginning of this video, I added a thin layer of clay everywhere. And the reason for this is simply that when I add more clay to start modeling the actual figure, I want to be able to push this clay in where I want to make holes or make like crevices, like the eye sockets and stuff like that. And I don't want to risk that I suddenly can't push the clay in far enough and hit the tinfoil instead. So by adding this base coating of clay, I ensure that I have enough to work with underneath the actual clay I'm adding to model the figure. As you can see from this video, the way I tend to model these things, based on my very limited experience so far, is by adding small geometric shapes to slowly build up the figure. I don't really remove clay again. I've done some stuff with regular clay previously, like regular ceramic clay, and my process there tended to be just as much removing clay as adding clay. But I find with this polymer clay that it's really more efficient for me and more natural to simply add clay all the time instead of ever removing any clay. So like you can see here, when I add the jawbone, I add like a cylinder I wrap around and then smooth out. When I was adding the cheekbones, I added 2 balls for each cheekbone. Sometimes I'll model it a bit more, like the nose. I modeled that almost finished before I added it, simply because once it's in place, it's hard to get my tool in and really model it without disturbing the things around it. But other than that, I model most everything when they're actually on the figure. It's easy to get carried away with adding too much detail to one little area. And with my limited experience so far, I found that it really helps the figure a lot if you keep the same detail level over the entirety of the figure. So, but typically when I catch myself starting to add too much detail to one area, I need to like ask myself, is this really what I want to do with the rest of the figure, but also am I actually able to keep up this level of detail with some of the other things? Like the hair you see in this figure, which is turns out to be what I'm spending the most of my time modeling, and this little guy. That's really, I had to find some kind of mid-level way where it was tempting to simply, keep modeling tiny little strands of hair, but then suddenly that would look out of place with the rest of the figure that was much simpler. So it was a question of experimenting a bit and finding a balance that would work both for the hair and make it look right together with the rest of the guy. So it kind of looked like it was on the same scale and not of two different scales. Once you're done modeling your figure, you need to bake it in the oven to let the clay set. As far as I understand, this type of clay is made from tiny particles of PVC floating in a petroleum type liquid. So what you're actually doing when you're baking it is evaporating the petroleum and melting the little pieces of PVC together. So generally, the clay will stay completely soft as long as you haven't baked it. Even you don't even need to cover it or anything; it'll just stay soft by itself. So once you bake it, it becomes completely hard, and you can start sanding it or drilling it or whatever you need to do to polish up the last little details of your model. The instructions say that you should bake this at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes per 1/4 inch thickness. But after reading up on what other people were doing, there seems to be a consensus that you're better off baking it longer at a lower temperature. So most people were recommending baking at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for only for twice the length, so for 30 minutes per 1/4 inch thickness. And so for these little miniature busts here, that's what I've been doing. I've simply been baking them at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. And that seemed to work really well. I mean, I'm not sure if they've had enough. They might still have some moisture in the center, but at least for my purposes here, they've definitely gone hard enough that they don't lose their shape. After baking, I first let the figure cool off completely, both to get any vapor out, but also to ensure that I'm not overheating the acrylics I use to paint it afterwards. Before I start actually painting with colors, I prime it. I've chosen to prime my little figures with a gesso instead of a regular primer. And I'm not sure if this really makes a difference or if I might actually be better off using a regular primer. But my experience with the gesso from Golden Acrylics is that it's very, very, very good at containing oil and petroleum-based products. So should I not? Should my little figures here be underbaked? With the gesso on it here, I don't need to worry too much about the petroleum leaking out and discoloring the paints I've added on it. But if you really want to be sure and really ensure the longevity of your art pieces here, you probably want to do 3 or 4 layers of gesso. And at that point, you should probably be aware of this when you're modeling, that that's going to take away some of your details simply from the thickness of the actual gesso. After letting the gesso dry out completely, I paint my little figures using my regular acrylic paints from Golden, and I basically use the same type of painting techniques that I use when I paint regular 2D art, and I found that works really well for these little figures. The only thing is that I found in some of the first ones I did that I was trying too much to create shadows and highlights like I would in regular pictures, and since the model is actually getting its own light and thus casting its own little shadows on its face, that seemed to sort of conflict with the actual shadows there, giving it sort of a less natural look. So what I found that works better than that is to really vary between light and dark in any creases. Like, so you'll see here the eye sockets, I'll paint those darker. Little wrinkles, I'll paint those darker. The hair, I'll paint darker at the base and then lighten it at the top. And that kind of just attenuates the natural shadows that'll be on the figure, and gives it a more textured look. It really makes a big difference from just giving it like a flat color. So other than that, there's not much to say. As I said, I use my regular painting technique, which is typically that I give I start with a thick base coat of whatever color it is I'm working on, and then I apply thin, very watery washes over that, slowly layer by layer, to build up not just the colors I want, but also some kind of texture in it. So typically, instead of getting like a very flat and even color, I try to get like a texture of colors underneath. So when you see this guy's skin tones, it's not just one flat skin tone, it's all sorts of little variations in color. And those I create by using different layers of, in this case, burnt ochre and so crimson red and white and burnt sienna. And again, just in really, really thin layers with a lot of water in it. Another positive side of using these layers of paint with a lot of water is that the paint will then naturally collect in the little creases in the figure and in the little whatever structure there might be. So the effect I was talking about with making it light at the top and dark at the bottom, that's gonna naturally happen when you paint it with these little layers of color, especially if you let the darker colors be more wet than the lighter colors. So for example, the hair, I started giving, I give that a somewhat base color tone, and then I add shadows with a really wet color, and then I add the highlights with a less wet color, so that's gonna stay more at the top, whereas the really dark one kind of sank in all the way to the bottom. So far, I've not really been giving these little figures any kind of varnish when I've completed them, but it is something I plan to look into, and you should probably do it too if you start making little figures. Not as much for the protection of the longevity of the colors, especially if you're using good quality acrylic colors like Golden. Those will pretty much take care of themselves, but having an extra layer will protect them from being bumped, since the carrying around of these little figures, if you give them to somebody or sell them to somebody, it's gonna be harder to transport them without dinging them and chipping off little pieces of the paint. So you might want to add a little coat of varnish simply to protect the coloring under transport, or if people are picking them up. It's a really nice little object to pick up and look at, so it'll only be natural for people to wanting to do that, and that's gonna obviously make it easy for the paint to get scratched and thus ruin the finish of the little figure. If you do decide to varnish little figures, you should probably be careful about what kind of level of glossiness you're using. I imagine that what I'm gonna start experimenting with is using different levels of translucent acrylic mediums as like a finishing varnish on it. So I might, for the eyes, use a very glossy, and then for the coat use a very matte. But as I said, I haven't actually done any of that myself. I hope you enjoyed this little video. This was, as I said, my first little recording of my progress in making these little guys. As I said, I've only been doing this for a couple of days, so don't put too much into what I've said in here. I might, for all I know, be completely full of shit. Leave me a comment, send me an email. If people enjoy this, I'll probably record some more. Thanks for watching.